Another example of this is found in 1 Samuel chapter 10. It's one of my favorite stories of the gifts of the Spirit in operation in the life of Samuel. He tells Saul, young Saul, after he's just anointed him to be the commander of the king's army, he tells him a whole series of things that were about to happen, that he was going to be going. I mean, the detail in them, when you read it, the detail, you're going to be going to this place and you're going to see 3 men and they're going to have certain amounts of food and they're going to give you some, and just the detail of it is one of the most amazing levels of word of wisdom that you'll ever see. It's stunning. We don't hardly ever see anybody operating at this level today. It does happen. It's very, very rare. It's not common. And so that's a profound example. We had just talked about the study here just recently. But when you read that, go through it and check off the number of things that he's predicting that's going to happen that day, that he's going to actually see. And then the author of Samuel goes through and checks it off and shows that it came to pass exactly. That's word of wisdom. It's a predictive quality that reveals the future. Now, we need to find these expressions in Jesus' ministry. And one of the clearest ones you see is in Luke chapter 22, verse 34. Jesus said, "You'll deny me." Peter gets his knickers in a twist and he says, "No, that's not going to happen." And then Jesus zeroes in on him and says, "Before the cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. Is that right? Did I get it right? Before it crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. Very specific. And it happened. Peter's denying the Lord. The little servant girl's asking him if he's from Galilee, if he's one of the disciples. He's denying. And then he hears the cock crowing. What makes that really unusual is roosters don't normally crow at night. And so to pull that out, to have said that, is stunning. And it actually happened. Peter heard, after he denied the Lord 3 times, he heard the cock crow. He looks through the window, and at that moment, Jesus turns his head toward him, and they lock eyes. And he knew, and he fled. He cried his heart out, and he fled. Needed to be restored to the Lord. Another one, another one that happened in Jesus' ministry is Jesus is in this little town about 3 kilometers outside of Jerusalem, and they're about to have a feast, have a last meal together, send some disciples into a neighboring town just a short distance away, Bethany and Bethpage. These are little towns just outside of little villages. They're still there. And he sends them into a neighboring village, and he says, "Now, you're going to see a man carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him, see where he goes, and wherever he goes, say, we want the place that you've prepared for the Lord." I mean, there's just no way he could have known that. And the fact that it was a man carrying a pitcher of water, that was unusual. That's women's work. That's very different. I told that story recently in church and kind of gave a plausible, possible backstory of why he was doing that. You know, he was building this place that no one was going to use, no one was renting, and his wife giving him a hard time. She says, "You carry the water, you know, you do it." But anyway, it came to pass exactly the way Jesus had seen it. And so the thing about word of wisdom is it can be conveyed on like a train car of prophecy. Lots of things can go on prophecy. It's like a bed that conveys these other revelation gifts. And it can also just happen in terms of a vision. It's possible that Jesus saw it, and then said it. But it's predictive. It's a little bit of the future, a glimpse of the future. A major one, and a stunning one, one that must have just really shocked people to hear. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 2, he describes the destruction of the temple. No one could have seen that. No one could have predicted that. And to say that not one stone will be left on top of another, that literally came to pass. The Romans, when they destroyed the city, that was one of their objectives, was to destroy it once and for all. And you'd have to go underground. I've been in the tunnels under the Western Wall, and there are some stones that are still on top of each other, and some of them are twice as long as the wall in this house, like huge, huge stones. But Jesus predicted that, and that's a glimpse of the future, a fragment, just a little piece, a word of wisdom. In the New Testament, we're looking for these kinds of expressions. You don't see very many. You see some in the book of Acts. Really nothing that I can see in Paul's epistles. But what we do see is Ananias hearing from the Lord, and he goes in and he says, "Brother Saul, Jesus sent me to pray for you to recover your sight." And in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, he starts to relay to Saul, who became Paul, a little more detail. And it's possible that he heard it. Jesus definitely said, "This is a special servant of mine. I will show him how much he will suffer for me." Told him that he was called. But in Acts 9:15, he shows him a little bit more of his purpose. And that's when word of wisdom really shines the most, is you're standing in front of people, you're praying for them, and you can tell them a little bit more of where they're going to end up, what their future holds, what their purpose is, their calling and their purpose. And that's one of the most beautiful expressions of word of wisdom that we see today. And so that's an example of Ananias. It doesn't say that he had that gift. I grant that. It doesn't say that he definitely had the baptism of the Spirit, definitely had abilities to see and hear from the Lord. It doesn't say this is a word of wisdom, but it's acting like it. Could it be a one-time thing? Yes, it could be, and I have to grant that. But that's how few examples that we can actually point to in the New Testament. But someone who did operate as a prophet in the New Testament is a guy named Agabus. And in Acts chapter 11, beginning in verse 28 to 30, Agabus comes through and he begins predicting a drought, a national calamity. And it happened. And a famine resulted in it. But he's being used of the Lord to predict momentarily something of the future. And it's just a small fragment, a glimpse, saying a famine is coming. And it gave the church a chance to prepare. One of the most profound things was that during this famine, Jerusalem was hit very, very hard. The believers there were hit very hard. But it was the Gentile church where Paul was working that had some means, and he would go and collect an offering to be able to relieve the church at Jerusalem during this time of famine. So it shows how the prophets can serve the body and actually predict these kinds of calamities. There's lots of people who regularly predict national disasters. I get a chuckle of the ones who always say, "I predicted it after the event." You know, you think about 9/11, no one was predicting that before, but it's funny to hear the guys who come up after and say, "I predicted that." It's a little chintzy. I just don't see that. So Agabus is functioning as a prophet. Another example of him crossing paths with Paul as Paul's making his way back to Jerusalem, where he's going to be arrested and go on an amazing journey of standing before Caesar. In Acts chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, you see Agabus ministering to Paul actually acting out prophetically, taking his belt off and wrapping him up in it and saying, the man who owns this belt is going to be put in the bonds. And it didn't change Paul's direction, but it was in keeping with what the Spirit had been saying. He said everywhere he went, the Spirit was warning him of dangers that were coming. And Philip's daughters were very prophetic, and they were picking up stuff as well. And the Holy Spirit was actually speaking to Paul's own heart. It didn't prevent him from going toward it, but there's something about it, you can endure something so much better if you know the Lord's in it, if you know that He knows. Just knowing that He knows changes everything. And that's an example of it. It didn't prevent him from getting into trouble, but it prepared him for it. So that's another way that word of wisdom is useful. Let's look at word of knowledge in just a minute.